Andre Hoyt believed that stories were a kind of magic. Words wove a spell, out came a rabbit, flowers, a dove, a lovely lady, a hero, laughter, tears. And Andre Hoyt believed that stories were a kind of medicine. They had the power to heal, to make people feel better. When he was very young, his mother and father read stories to him, filling him, he believed, with magic and medicine, powerful effects. When he was older, he read stories constantly and thought there could be nothing more wonderful to be than a teller of tales, both true and tall. Andre was good with words. He enjoyed words. Words were living things to him, and he liked using them to tell stories. And stories were even better than words. It was a case of the whole being more than the sum of the parts, the way stories could make the way stones could make a cathedral. A good story had architecture and feeling. It could be memorable, even unforgettable, for its characters and action. For years, Andre jotted down his story ideas on a pad he always carried. Later wrote them out at length, then clipped and polished them until they were fine and shining. In truth, they were plain and simple. Andre did not believe in being overwrought. All around him, the world favored garishness and glitter, scandal and oddity, but Andre staked his claim in the ordinary, the common, everyday, believing it was every bit as rich. Instead of cathedrals and casinos and skyscrapers, Andre built modest domiciles. He would mail his plain and simple stories out to publications, to popular magazines with circulation in the millions, to literary journals with subscribers in the hundreds. Andre tried every outlet he could find, but the result was always the same, the inevitable rejection slip. There was no market for plain and simple stories. "We are sorry," the editors would say, "but we have no room for you at this time. Please do not consider this a final estimation of your work. We hope you have success in placing it elsewhere." Andre tried to place it elsewhere. Like a social worker trying to find a home for an unwanted child. He tried everywhere, but the answer was always the same. No one was interested in his stories. They had the liability of being understated and easily overlooked, and their author was a complete unknown. He continued to write new ones and to save the old ones with no luck. If luck had played any part in it, Andre would have succeeded, for he made, over many years, thousands of submissions, each one without one acceptance. Everyone knows the pain of rejection, but for Andre the pain was particularly keen. The way Andre understood it, an unpublished story is an untold story, and nothing is crueler to a person than to have a story he cannot tell. For some reason having to do with talent or fate or the business of publishing, Andre was not allowed to tell his stories. Not one. Andre had hundreds of them, and to each one the world turned deaf ears. His pain was deep and lasting and constantly fresh. One acceptance might have mitigated the sorrow of all the untold stories, but it never came. Andre had married when he was younger, but his wife had died in an automobile accident before they had any children. He did not remarry. His only progeny were his stories, and the unpublished ones became like unborn babies for him. He felt bereavement for them, such as a woman who has suffered a miscarriage might feel. They were living, they had names, yet they never came to life. After many years, Andre began to despair that any of his stories would ever be published. But he was not a weak-willed man. He believed in his stories when he wrote them, and he continued to believe in them. He did not abandon any of them. He trusted that they had a value of their own. He found comfort in the joy of living, in the happiness of writing, and in accidental reassurances, such as when he heard a church choir sing during a performance of Handel's Messiah, "He was despised, rejected, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief." Andre had long had the habit of carrying a story around with him. In a spare moment he could take it out and work on it, trim, reshape, calculate the next turn. In his later years, when he stopped sending stories out in the mail, Andre began to carry finished stories around with him, too. It was partly out of the old habit, and partly because he simply felt happier knowing that they were so near to him, all his beautiful stories. They were a comfort to him. And there was an element of calculation in it too, based on one last flickering, inextinguishable hope. Like anyone who's been faithful to a long obsession, Andre had lost all perspective. His hope became a dream. In it, he was with a group of people, and they were eagerly listening to him as he told story after story, at last introducing them, one by one, to the world. Andre carried stories in the pockets of his pants, and the pockets of his shirts, and he even rolled up stories inside his hat. He stuffed stories in his shoes, and he pinned stories in the waistband of his trousers. Andre became a walking anthology of his own work. He had stories lining his coat, stories inside his umbrella, stories carefully taped to his long underwear. After he retired from his job in the library, Andre would find a bench in the park or at a bus stop, sit down and begin to tell one of his favorite stories. He didn't need to take out the paper. He knew them by heart. Of course, the people around him, if there were any, ignored him, this shabby old man talking to himself. They thought he was crazy or drunk or was just a poor old soul who had lost his mind. Ironically, in this extremity created by his passion, Andre had himself become the possible subject for a story the world could appreciate, a footnote worth a few lines on the National Wire. Did you hear one about the guy who... But no one did. One cold winter day, while sitting on a bench waiting for a bus, Andre suffered a heart attack and died. He had fallen asleep while waiting, so his passing was peaceful, and since he was 82 years old, not completely unexpected. Nevertheless, to eliminate any suspicion of foul play, police examined his body and an autopsy was performed. The autopsy revealed that heart failure was clearly the cause of his demise. The policeman charged with compiling a list of the deceased's effects, a Sergeant Abernathy, noted the paper that lined the man's clothes and reckoned that he was using it for warmth, protection against the cold, a common practice among the homeless. Sergeant Abernathy did wonder briefly why the man had chosen what appeared to be letters instead of the more available padding of newspaper. He concluded that these were perhaps personal communications from friends and acquaintances that possibly had some special significance beyond insulation for the departed. But that was speculation, and he did not include it in his report. It may have been that the poor guy had found a box of papers in a dumpster somewhere. Sergeant Abernathy did not inspect the writing further. He did not sense the presence of magic or feel the power of medicine. The papers, the sole edition of the collected works of Andre Hoyt, as it were, as well as the man's clothing, were discarded and burned, as was his body, bringing the untold stories of this man to an end.